We're going to spend the next few minutes just diving into the concept of templates in Argo Workflows. So hopefully you're in the right room. Before we get to the good stuff, just to introduce ourselves, my name's Tim. I'm the infrastructure guy at Pipekit. I'm an Argo and an Argo Helm maintainer. I'm an Argo Workflows and Argo Helm maintainer. And I spend quite a lot of my time in the CNCF Slack answering questions and stuff like that. So if you've asked questions in there, you've probably spoken to me at some point.
And hi, I'm Becky Pauley. I am an Argo project enthusiast, and I am also a senior solutions engineer at Jetstack Consult, which is part of CyberArk. We are a team of Kubernetes and cloud-native experts. We help customers to optimize and secure their cloud-native environments.
And just a little bit about Pipekit. We're a group of Argo maintainers and experts. We regularly contribute to Argo Workflows, as well as other Argo and other open source projects. If you're an Argo user and you're after a support SLA, we have a support subscription as a means of continuing Argo support. We also offer an enterprise-level control plane for Argo Workflows. Does things like make your RBAC life easier, lets you set up triggering events and stuff like that without having to do any complex code. Gives you a single pane of view across multiple clusters with Argo Workflows. We scale significantly higher, faster, better, stronger than open source Argo Workflows as well. So come and have a chat with us if you're having any Argo Workflows scaling issues. So today we're going to take a deep dive into Argo Workflows templates. We're going to recap a few basics before digging into two important concepts, template invocators and template definitions. As we go, we'll try and offer some advice on what's possible, what to use when, and some pitfalls to avoid. This talk is accompanied by a set of working examples for every template type we're going to cover. And so you have the opportunity to take all that, play along at home at your own pace later. So you can find those examples by scanning this code. I'll give you this code later as well, so don't worry too much. And just to make sure you're staying awake, towards the end of this talk, we're going to invite you to give your feedback on some of the stuff that we're going to demonstrate today. You have an opportunity to shape the future of the Argo project. So in the next 20 minutes or so, our aim is that you leave with an understanding of the different template types, how to use them, and in the process, we hope you discover features you may not have known Argo Workflows has. Before we jump too deep into templates, just have a quick recap for those of us in the room who may be new to Argo Workflows. I will keep this brief. There's a much more comprehensive overview that Becky and my colleague Darko did. You can follow that QR code there and go through and watch that talk. So at a high level, what is Argo Workflows? So Argo Workflows orchestrates workflows in Kubernetes. In other words, it's a thing doer. It schedules Kubernetes pods in a specific order, so you can string them together and just get it to do something. When we define a workflow, it looks a little like the YAML on the left. The important logic is contained within our workflow spec, and we can see it has a clear structure, an entry point and a list of template definitions. In this example, we have a simple workflow spec with just one step, a single template definition. Of course, we could have multiple templates listed in a workflow spec. These template definitions can be loosely thought of as functions. They define instructions to be executed. The entry point field defines what the main function will be, that is, the template that will be executed first. Of course, there's much more that we can do than just this, and there are many different template types to cover. In all, there are 9 types of template available in Argo Workflows, divided into 2 different categories. There's template invocators. They're used to invoke or call other templates. They provide execution control for our workflows. And there's template definitions. These, as we've mentioned, are what define the work to be done. They act like functions. So let's take a look at our template invocators. A steps template does exactly what it says. It allows you to define your tasks in a series of steps. These steps can be run sequentially, in parallel, or a combination of both. The way we control the order of these steps is in the structure of the template, which is set out as a list of lists. Normally, outer lists will run sequentially, one after another, and then inner lists will run in parallel. So while outer and inner lists give us some way to control the sequential and parallel steps, there are many more ways to control the order of execution as you become more familiar with Argo Workflows. So, for example, you can use a when clause to conditionally execute steps. But if you're just getting started with workflows, the most important thing to know is that a steps template allows you to define a series of steps to run. The other template invocator we can use is a DAG. A DAG template invocator allows us to define tasks as a graph of dependencies rather than a list of steps. In other words, in a DAG, you list all your tasks and you set which others must complete before a particular task can begin. Tasks with no dependencies will be run immediately. So in our example here, the gen_rand int task will run immediately. It has no dependencies. Any others, however many that also have no dependencies, will also be run in parallel with it. Our echo output and container set tasks both depend on gen_random_int, so once that one finishes, these next two will be run in parallel. So our two choices of template invocators are steps or DAG templates, but which should we use and when? In many cases, you can achieve the same thing using either, but there are some differences between the two, and there are situations where one may be better suited. Steps are simpler, they're more readable for small deterministic workflows, but you'll find them restrictive as they only really allow for sequential or parallel execution. So use steps for short deterministic pipelines. DAGs offer much more flexibility and control for larger workflows. You can define many dependencies in a large workflow, and Argo Workflows will use all the information and work out the best parallelism for your tasks. Some people can find the DAG structure harder to parse in the YAML, especially when first getting started, or if the DAG is not well laid out in that YAML. Use a DAG when a workflow requires more flexibility. Generally, once you have some familiarity with Argo Workflows, and when a workflow has more than a few steps, I would personally recommend you use a DAG.
Now we've covered our template invocators, so our steps and DAG templates, let's have a look at the options we have for defining each individual step or task in our workflow. There are 7 of these in total, so we'll start with probably the most familiar, the container template definition. Exactly as we'd expect, the container template allows us to define a container that will run as a workflow step. Here we've got a very simple hello world example, which Argo Workflows will run inside a pod for us. When this runs, the standard output from our step is collected and saved into something called the result output parameter, which means we can use that in later steps. This probably looks very familiar. The spec for our template here is the same as the Kubernetes container spec, so you can define a container here the same way you would anywhere else in Kubernetes. You can't see it in this example, but it's also possible for us to use init and sidecar containers here too. Now, just because this is simple doesn't mean it isn't powerful. In many cases, this template type is a great option and a sensible default choice. If in doubt, start with a container template. But of course, there are other options available to us. And the first of these looks an awful lot like what we were just talking about. That's because this option, the script template, is really a convenience wrapper around a container template. You'll notice we've added the source field, which allows us to define a script in place. And this script is saved into a file and executed for you inside that container using the command you specify. Similar to a container template, the result of the script is automatically exported into that result variable so you can use it in later steps. But there is a difference because the script must be able to run from a file. If the command you specify doesn't know how to run things from a file, use a container template instead. The key takeaway here is really, most of the time, unless you have a strong preference for a script template, you may as well use a container template. But both of these types do have some limitations. What about if we want to be able to run multiple containers in the same pod and we want to control some dependencies between those containers? We want to order them. This is what the container set template is designed to help us with. It allows us to run multiple user-defined containers in a single step, so a single pod, and to define the order in which they run. We can see an example here with 2 containers, but of course we could have more. And because they run in the same pod, they'll be scheduled on the same host, which means they'll have a shared workspace and empty directory volume. Use a container set template when you want to combine short-lived containers into one step. This is efficient because it reduces the time and resource overhead of waiting for multiple init and wait containers to spin up. As we mentioned, because you can set out dependencies, you also have control over ordering. Be aware, as their name implies, these can only use container templates within them, not script, resource, etc. And using multiple containers in the same pod has resource and scheduling implications, especially if those containers are larger. So we would recommend looking at the guidance on understanding and setting resource requests for these templates in the Argo Workflows docs linked here. This brings us to our next question, which is what if we want to run something that is not a container? Well, another option is to act directly on Kubernetes resources in our workflow step. We do this using the resource template. This template allows us to take all the typical actions you would expect to be able to take against Kubernetes resources: get, create, apply, delete, replace, or patch commands. For example, on the right here, we have a resource template that sets out a config map we want to create in the cluster. What happens when this actually runs? Technically, I've been slightly misleading here because I said no containers. In reality, there is still a container running here. It's just we haven't defined it and we don't normally need to care about it. Instead, when this resource template runs, Workflow Controller actually creates a pod for us. It manages handling that action, in this case, creating a config map. We'd like to spend a little bit longer on the resource template here because we have a few tips we hope will help you get the most out of them. First of all, think about what you want to happen to these resources at the end of your workflow. Do you want resources created by a resource template to be cleaned up when your workflow ends? If you don't need to do anything. But if you do, you can use the set owner reference field to enable this. You can also set success condition and failure condition so your workflow step knows whether or not the resource ran or deployed successfully. And if you would like to be able to get pod logs from the resource template into your workflow logs, there is a magic label for that. We label the pod with the workflow name so that this can be picked up and then you can see those logs in the UI. Of course, whilst we are talking about resources, it's worth mentioning that a workflow itself is a type of Kubernetes resource. This means you can use a resource template to create more workflows. This is commonly known as the workflow of workflows pattern. You can find examples and discussion of this in the docs. But remember, when defining a resource template, Kubernetes RBAC still applies. If you want to perform an action on a resource, make sure the service account you're using has permission to perform that action. And for all these cases where you are doing something to a resource, you could actually do all of these things inside a pod running kubectl commands. In other words, you could do these things in a container template. Why does this matter? Well, if we're acting on or changing one or two resources, then a resource template just makes sense. Argo Workflows handles a bunch of stuff for us. However, if you need to run multiple commands, lots of actions on many resources, that means lots of resource templates and, more importantly, lots of pods. So, depending on what you want to do, how much visibility you want Argo Workflows to have over this, what you'd like to be able to see in the UI, and how much resource efficiency matters in your scenario, sometimes a resource template makes complete sense and is the right choice. But if you're thinking purely about efficiency and you want to perform many actions, this might be more efficient inside a container template. One thing that does not happen inside its own container is the suspend templates. We use these when we want to pause or suspend workflow execution, either for a given duration, like the 20 seconds here, or until it is resumed manually. We can resume either from the CLI, the UI, or the API endpoint. When this template is used, it doesn't use cluster resources. Instead, when our delay step here is active, that suspension is handled within Workflow Controller itself. This is one of the very few times where a step or task in Argo Workflows is not equivalent to a pod running in Kubernetes. That feels like a good time for us to take a step back and look at what we have covered so far. The container template, which runs our defined container inside a pod, the script template, our convenience wrapper around a container template that runs a script, the container set for running multiple containers within the same pod with some dependencies defined. We spent a bit of time discussing the resource template, which allows us to perform actions directly on Kubernetes resources, and of course the suspend template, which allows us to suspend workflow execution. 5 covered, 2 more to go, and we've left some interesting ones till last. These 2 have some commonalities it's worth us digging into. The HTTP and plugin templates both run in a special pod, the agent pod, which Argo manages for us. If we use multiple instances of these template types within the same workflow, Argo will reuse this one pod for those subsequent steps. This saves time on pod startup and uses cluster resources efficiently. However, it does mean we need to add some extra permissions, which we've linked to here, and it abstracts some logic away, which may make it a little bit harder for us to reason about. The HTTP template is useful when we want to communicate out to third-party systems. This template type allows us to execute HTTP requests and capture the response. The body of the request is automatically exported into that result variable that we mentioned earlier, and that means, again, we can use it in later steps. In this example, we are making a very simple GET request, but we could use any standard request method here. This template gives us many options to configure our request, and again, we can use success and failure conditions to determine whether a step should be marked as failed or successful. You can find a more detailed walkthrough of this template type in the video that we've linked in the slides. Our final template type is the plugin, and there are actually 2 important concepts here. The plugin template, which we see on the left, and something called an executor plugin. A plugin template runs or references an executor plugin. That's something that we need to have defined beforehand, and then the plugin template allows us to use that in a workflow step or task. Executor plugins were introduced to allow users to extend Argo workflows without needing to learn the code base or contribute directly to it. These can be written in any language, so you don't have to use Go if you don't want to, and they run as a containerized application that responds to RPC HTTP requests. A few things to note: executor plugins are not enabled by default, and if considering plugins, our advice is use with caution. And the reason we're saying this is because if you're using them they're not really intended as a library or shared bank of vetted plugins. You'll need to vet them yourself if you want to use ones that have already been written. They're more for specific custom needs that aren't met by any other template type. In other words, use them where they make sense, but avoid reinventing the wheel. Is there another existing template type that makes sense here? Perfect time to remind ourselves of those other template types. And one of the aims of this talk is to try and make your use of templates in Argo Workflows easier. The easiest rule here is consider if there is a template type that clearly meets your needs. If there is, use that one. If not, start by trying to use a container template. That's because these are easy to reason about and under your control. Another way to make things easier is to set sensible defaults. In particular here, we are talking about template defaults. You can set these in Workflow Controller Config Map, that's your global or Argo Workflows wide defaults, at the workflow level, or you can override these in individual templates where the defaults don't suit.
I've been looking forward to this slide for some time. So we taught you some stuff. I'm going to rant for a bit now. So let's imagine for a second we're using the Argo CLI to interact with Argo Workflows. Let's run this command, Argo template list. Based on everything you've learned so far, we expect it will list all the available template types or something. No. This command is related to a feature of Argo Workflows called workflowTemplates, which is all one word and absolutely nothing to do with workflowTemplates with a space that we've been talking to you about today. I don't have a lot of time to dive into workflow templates, one word here, but at a high level, they're a special type of workflow that you can reuse with other workflows or even other workflow templates, one word. Let's consider another scenario. You're looking at your workflow controller logs to diagnose an issue, and you see workflow template with a space not found. Naturally, as a user, you should know that this log line is referencing workflow templates, or one word, and not workflow templates with a space, despite the space. So at this point, we've learned two things. Workflow templates, one word, are distinctly different from workflow templates with a space, despite the similar name and the misuse of the naming convention throughout the Argo Workflows application. And number two, I'm bad at slide titles. So to summarize, workflow templates, one word, contain workflow templates with a space. But they may also call workflow templates, one word, which in turn may contain workflow templates with a space. Oh, this is the beginning. So that's clear as mud now, right? So let's ramp it up. So in order to run a workflow template with a space, from a workflow template, one word, you use a thing called a template ref, one word, to access the workflow template with a space from the workflow template, one word, by specifying the name of the workflow template with a space, using the field template, and the name of the workflow template, one word, using the field name. There's also cluster workflow templates. They're equally unhelpfully called cluster-template in the CLI, which are workflow templates, one word, with are cluster scoped instead of namespace scoped. So cluster workflow templates will contain workflow templates with a space. They may call cluster workflow templates, one word. They may also call workflow templates, also one word, which in turn may contain workflow templates with a space. The point of my purposefully obtuse ranting is I wanted to take a moment to recognize that this is not a helpful situation for us to be in as end users. I fully recognize how confusing these concepts can be for new users and experienced users alike, especially when someone like me stands up on a stage and does a really bad job of explaining it to you. And if that hasn't got you confused enough, we should have a chat about the word node in Argo Workflows later on. We'd like to do something to fix this. We do need your help, though. Can you please take a few minutes to scan that QR code right now while I'm talking? I'm going to keep waffling for a bit. We'd like to gather your thoughts on maybe I'm just alone here and I just really wanted to rant on a stage, but probably not. And I'd really just like your input to help with the project there. If you're a seasoned workflowser, I'd like to know if this still really irks you as much as me. If you're new, I'd like to get your feedback as well. Was that super confusing or not? Your feedback will help to shape if and or how we address this in the future. And to try and sort of prove we're genuinely interested, I've listed out all the PRs that we pushed upstream purely off the back of writing this talk. We found areas where the docs weren't super clear, and we went back and we fixed it and we pushed it all up. Incidentally, if you're interested in giving back to the project, a bit scared of the code, that sort of stuff, the docs are a really good place to start, and I'm more than happy to mentor you through that. Thank you to everyone who filled out the survey, and if you haven't, it's still up there. Please scan it. It's really helpful if you do. The short link at the top left is the link to this talk with that repo that I was telling you about. And finally, if you get any Argo or Kubernetes questions, please do come and find me and my Pipekit colleagues on booth S590 throughout KubeCon. We'd love to have a chat. And CyberArk also have a booth on the north side at N763. Thank you very much.